Tehran says recent U.S. accusations against Iran show Washington's frustration and failure of its maximum pressure campaign. Iran's foreign ministry spokesman said resorting to these old baseless tricks and claims will not help the U.S. repair its tarnished reputation. Saeed Khatibzadeh made the remarks in response to accusations leveled by the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo that Iran has ties with the al-Qaeda terrorist group. Khatibzadeh said that Pompeo had made the same accusations against the Islamic Republic in the past. Attention from the real supporters of terrorism, which are Washington and its allies. Spokesman stressed that Iran's been a victim of U.S. state terrorism for years, adding Iran has a clear record of fighting terrorist groups. Earlier, the Iranian foreign minister dismissed Pompeo's allegations as warmongering lies. And now joining us for this news review is David Yahubian, professor of history, joining us from Cal State University, San Bernardino, California, and Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, joining us from Bristol. Gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you both to the program here. I guess we'll start there in sunny California with you, David. What's up, bud? Hope you're doing well. Your thoughts on the story, please.
Thanks, Daniel. It's always great to be with you. There's really not much that I can statement by Mohammed Javad Zarif, because as always he rather colorfully and accurately has called out the misinformation and the lies of the warmongers, in this case Mike Pompeo. But what I think is important to consider is the motivations for Mike Pompeo to make this statement, this bogus claim right now. And I think just briefly that there's three motivations that we can look to. First of all, he is trying desperately to throw up as much of a narrative and misinformation web, and as well, of course, a legal web to try to prohibit the return to the JCPOA by the incoming Biden administration. And so this most recent is, I think, designed for that specific purpose. As well, he is politicking. It's very clear right now. There's an article on Foreign Policy talking about how Mike Pompeo is trying to establish a legacy through a tour de force of Twitter bragging. So he's interested in potentially a 2024 presidential run with Nikki Haley. And so I believe that this also serves that purpose. But last, this is an attempt to obfuscate the fact that, to paraphrase him, the only new home for al-Qaeda in the last few years that we could speak of is the home that the United States and Saudi Arabia have enabled to be created in Syria, in the Idlib province, as well as in the so-called Al-Tanf exclusion zone. The United States and American tax dollars have gone to fund this motley stew of Takfiri terrorists aimed at overthrowing the legitimate Syrian government. So I believe that Pompeo's inane claim is designed for these three purposes.
Thank you, David. And hey, Tony, I'd like to welcome you to the program. Tony, what's ironic here is, Iran has an ally in the Popular Mobilization Forces on Iraqi soil. Together, they're fighting what used to be al-Qaeda in Iraq is now Daesh or ISIL. On Syria, they're with the Syrian government going after, again, Daesh, which used to be al-Qaeda. In Yemen, Iran's allied with the Houthis. They're also going after Daesh and al-Qaeda remnants. So how is Iran in bed with al-Qaeda when it's losing to the war against al-Qaeda and Daesh? Okay, hold on. We got an issue with your voice, Tony. Hold on. Can we get that looked at and fixed? Hopefully, Tony, go ahead. Say something. Let me see if we got that fixed. Okay, no, your voice, we can't hear you, Tony, so hopefully our producers can get that fixed in the next minute or so. Oh, there we go. I think you're on. Go ahead, Tony.
So
we just lost you again. We got this so, and then the rest of it is off again. So, okay, you know what, David, go ahead. You answer that question. The irony in the in these allegations. We'll go back to Tony in about a minute. Go ahead.
I just say I would ask, project much to Mike Pompeo, because the United States is responsible for the initial creation of al-Qaeda. Of course, this goes back to Operation Cyclone and its attempt to support forces resisting the occupation of the Soviets in Afghanistan. The United States, through its actions, through its invasion of Iraq, and then through its both physical, monetary, as well as the support of arms to its proxies, is solely responsible for the creation of these radical groups in Iraq and Syria. And with the pretty much open support of the Saudi government and other Gulf states, and this is reflected in the documents that have been revealed or released by the American government or American government officials. In 2012, we have the very clear statement that the American government was well aware that a Salafist principality was being created in northern Syria, and this was just fine with Hillary Clinton and the Obama administration. And we have on record John Kerry talking about how American support for al-Qaeda and ISIS basically just, quote, got out of hand, end quote, in Syria in the U.S. government's attempt to destabilize the Syrian government.
Thank you, David. And Tony, we're going to finally see if we could get you on air right now. Go ahead, if you could hear us, your initial thoughts on this.
Well, look, I think what's happened here, it seems as if the al-Qaeda franchise secretly bought by Iran from NATO. Now, that seems to be what Pompeo is implying here. Like it's some kind of McDonald's franchise. Look, of course, inane, our colleague was saying. These are inane comments. And the only way Pompeo can get away with this, and he knows this, is to have a supine press full in the Western world of journalists who just refuse to ask the basic questions. And so that's why he takes courage to make such absolutely ridiculous statements about al-Qaeda. Now let's look at al-Qaeda's pedigree, shall we? Because it actually began in the closing stages of the Second World War, believe it or not, with the SS Werewolf units, which were occupying areas at the closing stages of World War II. They were what's called stay-behind forces, the idea being that as the Allies and the Russians rolled over German territory, that they would cause disruption behind the lines and sabotage and this sort of thing. This whole idea was then taken up by NATO in something called Operation Gladio, where NATO in the 1980s particularly, but in other decades too, conducted a campaign of bombing against NATO's domestic population, believe it or not. This is mainly instigated by MI6 and the CIA, and also mainly in Italy, but also in Belgium and other countries too, where you had NATO fascist soldiers who were basically mercenaries working undercover NATO, blowing up, kidnapping Aldo Moro, the guy who was slated to be the Prime Minister of Italy, and assassinating him. So these are what you would call black operations, special operations. And now when it came to the 1980s and Operation Cyclone over in Afghanistan, these mercenaries basically were brought in and recruited into NATO by NATO, and they brought in these first Islamist mercenaries, and from there they went on, for example, to Bosnia, to other places like that, to the former Yugoslavia, as Muslim mercenaries working for NATO, and they've been working for NATO ever since. Now, a point when it came to the September the 11th attacks, of course, that was al-Qaeda, and now apparently that the al-Qaeda operation was actually at the time a Saudi operation. So what happens is over the decades, and in fact this goes right the way back to the agreements between Abdulaziz in Saudi Arabia and Roosevelt at the end of the Second World War, Bitter Lake it's called, the agreement, and they were making deals to finance these madrasas and various kind of schools in Saudi Arabia to cook up this really vicious new type. Well, we can't call it Islam because it was, although it was supposed to be based on the Quran, it's a twisting of it, as many have twisted the Bible over the years to their own ends. And this ideology was then fed to a bunch of mercenaries, and that's who al-Qaeda are. Since the dawn of ISIS, then what we found is that al-Qaeda has kind of gone out of fashion, but really many of these people just literally transferred as mercenaries for getting more pay for ISIS and al-Nusra and these other, what are effectively US British NATO front organisations. So that's really what we're talking about. For Pompeo to say that Iran is behind this, well, I mean, he is the pot calling the kettle black, isn't it? What he is he's just lying through his teeth, and he's accusing his enemies, that is Iran, in this case, of doing exactly what he has been doing for centuries. Well, actually decades. It seems like such a long time. But this stuff about anywhere near enough by the Western press, just by a few of us investigative journalists that get to the bottom of it to understand exactly what's going on here. These are proxy armies, Islamist armies. They've got nothing to do with Islam, just as the Templar back in medieval times had nothing to do with real Christianity.
Interesting stuff. And David, we have about 40 seconds left. Your final thoughts, please.
It's just going to be critical that the international community keeps a close eye on what the American government and American military are doing in Iraq and in the Persian Gulf in these last few waning days of the Trump regime, based on the tweets and the statements of Mike Pompeo, not just regarding Cuba, regarding China, regarding Yemen and Ansar Allah. Unfortunately, these still remain dangerous days.
All right, bud. Thanks. Two great guys. Very informative and always fun to have around. David Yacoubia from San Bernardino, California, and Tony Gosling there joining us out of Bristol. You bet. Until we see you guys again. And viewers, that's a wrap for this segment of your Press TV's News Review. Thanks for tuning in, and goodbye for now.